This is Global Order. I'm Hindol Sengupta. An old friend of Global Order has joined me in conversation once again. Air Marshal G.S. Bedi, of course, has been on this platform before. Today, I invited the Air Marshal, and he and I have been trying to coordinate this for a while. He's written a very important document about India's quest for hypersonic missiles. Now, these are highly technical issues, but the entire reason Global Order exists is to try and make these concepts, ideas, accessible to many more people so that we understand our own defense, our own sovereignty better. Air Marshal, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Sengupta. It's always a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I want to begin, Air Marshal, by asking you the question. There is a lot of confusion in the Indian media and elsewhere whether the BrahMos missiles that were used in Operation Sindoor were hypersonic missiles or not. I believe no, but there's a lot of confusion. Could you tackle that question first for us?
Yes, of course. Operation Sindoor is a very recent one, and it's natural that it invokes curiosity. And because people know one concept, one technology is there in the world, so one tends to confuse it. But no, like you rightly said, these BrahMos missiles are not hypersonic; they're essentially supersonic. And one of the only kind in the world, they are supersonic cruise missiles. Okay, they're generally the cruise missiles are subsonic. If you see other cruise missiles that we have, or even the one we have purchased for Rafale, etc., they are subsonic. But this is one a missile which is supersonic, but it is certainly not hypersonic. In fact, as we go along, we will discuss classically hypersonic missile, what it means and where the confusion lies. But to say for now that missiles used in Operation Sindoor, BrahMos was not hypersonic. Yes, there is a effort on to develop the hypersonic version of it, what they call BrahMos 2. So when that BrahMos 2 comes in, that will be hypersonic. But currently, the version which is with us is not hypersonic. It is supersonic indeed.
One of the things that caught a lot of people's eye a few months ago is this thing that India became only the fourth country in the world to have hypersonic missile capabilities. What does that really mean? Take us through.
No, see what happens is the whole quest for hypersonic. It started, and the countries which are leading are essentially America, Russia, and China. In whichever order. Russia, America, China, or America, Russia. Essentially, it started with the Americans. But then it seems that China has overtaken America. This has happened in every technology. Every technology starts in America, and then we find that China has overtaken that particular technology because they have a lot of ways and means to do that. But that aside, India, yes, started getting interested in hypersonic missiles, and the test that we did, which was publicized, was on 7th November 20, where HSTDV, Hypersonic Technology Demonstration Vehicle, it used scramjet engine. We will see subsequently what exactly scramjet engine is. It used scramjet engine for 20 seconds operation and achieved a hypersonic speed. Okay, and now I believe the ground tests have been done for a much larger duration of up to about 200 seconds. But world over, for a hypersonic cruise missile to be effective over ranges, you need approximately 1,000 seconds of operation. And so far, actually, I mean, on record, no country has really reached that figure for scramjet operation. The last reports of China was there 400 seconds, may have gone to 600 seconds and something like that. But it is that 1,000 seconds of scramjet operation which is still a distant possibility. So that is how India figures in this, in the quest for hypersonic missile. Now, should India have it? Should not India have it? Is a very different debate, and we will see as we go along that why exactly should we have it, and why any developed country, which wants to have credibility over world. Uh, Canvas, okay, must possess these kind of technologies. There are advantages with the these hypersonic weapons and over other conventional weapons or ballistic missiles, which we will see that how they are more advantageous. Incidentally, hypersonic speed is not new. Hypersonic speed has been there from the very beginning. When ballistic missiles or space shuttles, they are all hypersonic. Our satellites move at Mach 30 or something. But India is getting into it, and we are probably, making great steps in that. And I've explained it in the book that I wrote. India and hypersonics. On its flight towards hypersonic. So it's been analyzed in detail as to how the whole thing started. Sees the complete world invention, how they began, etc., etc., and takes us through what are the applications, what are the challenges, etc. So that is how that is right that India is on its way to develop this technology. Time frame, yes, it depends on how much effort and money we put into this experiment.
For people who want to understand this further, correct me if I'm wrong, a hypersonic missile essentially flies at about Mach 5 or higher. And now Mach 5 means 5 times the speed of sound. And these are missiles which, in common parlance, are described as quote unquote unstoppable. Would that be correct?
So what happens is there is definitely, they are called unstoppable. That is why the world is investing so much money into this. If you see the history of hypersonic, firstly, okay, let me get through to this that hypersonic technology, when we say what is hypersonic, what is subsonic, supersonic, trisonic, hypersonic, why are these names given? We say subsonic, which is less than Mach 1. Moment the speed increases beyond Mach 1, we say it is supersonic. And moment it increases, beyond Mach 5, like you said, we say it's hypersonic. So why these segments? I mean, are they watertight and why are they so? It is, it is not whimsical that at some speed range you give it a new name. Why these benchmarks or why these compartments were made? Because when the quest to follow higher and higher speed, okay, it got in, then people noticed that there was a speed at which certain changes happened. They were not linear in nature. Yeah, like keep increasing speed, certain things like your drag keeps increasing, the temperature keeps rising, etc., etc. It keeps happening in a linear fashion, right? There comes a stage where there is a drastic change. There is a sudden change which is not linear in nature. So you say, okay, something different is happening here. Okay, this is what happened at supersonic flight. Okay, then what happened as continued, etc., and then they found that when the body reached hypersonic Mach 5 or something, certain new changes took place. Okay, so they said, okay, this region needs to be dealt with separately. This region needs to be tackled separately. So that is why it came to be known as like hypersonic. And like you rightly said, it's Mach 5 and above. Speed of sound is approximately 340 meters per second. So when we are talking of Mach 5 speed, it's approximately, let's say 1.7 kilometers or so per second. Now that's a hell of a lot of speed, 1.7 kilometers per second. You can imagine the distance 1.7 kilometers in front of you and something, a missile is covering it in 1 second. So the defense against hypersonic is not only because it is at higher speed, okay, it is because it has got the capacity to maneuver, which is unique in hypersonic missiles or hypersonic vehicles, which was not so much available in ballistic missiles. Now let's see if it is question of only ballistic missiles. You may be surprised to know, or the audience, some audience may be surprised to know that ballistic missiles have been always traveling at hypersonic speeds. Your whether short-range ballistic missile, whether intercontinental ballistic missiles, whether all that, they have been going hypersonic since ages. Okay, and they why hypersonic? They go at much faster speed, but it's only when they enter the atmosphere they reduce. Their speed reduces because they are ballistic. The very word ballistic defines that they're not developing any power. Right? There is no power of their own. They are just falling by gravity and they accelerate. And now in the space, there is no drag. There is hardly any atmosphere there. There is nothing of that sort. So when that missile falls by virtue of its gravity, it gains a hell of a lot of speed. For example, your satellites, how are your satellites going around the Earth? By virtue of gravity, right? It is only gravity which keeps pulling, they are rotating at that speed that they reach almost 7 kilometers a second. Now, if you see 7 kilometers a second is something like Mach 25, 26. Okay. And they can't afford to go beyond that, because when you reach Mach 31 or something, you are in escape velocity. If something goes at Mach 31, it will escape, Earth's gravity and become satellite of the sun. Okay. So that apart, but vehicles or objects have been moving at that kind of speed, but they classically can't be called hypersonic weapons because they are not going hypersonic by virtue of their own power. Okay. And also their trajectory was such that they were all missiles and they just fell, some of them intercontinental ballistic missiles, if you see, they go up to 4,000, 5,000 kilometers up, in the atmosphere, and they fall from there when they have to cover, 8,000, 9,000 kilometers of distance. So when they fall, they acquire very high speed, but at re-entry, what happens is there is a lot of rise in temperature, etc. And their heat shields are there. And, once they negotiate that re-entry, thereafter, they just continue towards their target and very little maneuvering is left, because now something which is falling free fall, if that starts maneuvering, it will lose its lot of potential. Okay. So it was not able to maneuver so much. So what was the disadvantage with that? There were two disadvantages mainly, because when we are going to talk of hypersonic, then you must know why did we develop it. So one disadvantage was that, why ballistic missiles came into being. They actually, if you trace their history, they were invented to launch nuclear weapons. They said that, okay, if you have to launch nuclear weapon from surface to, another country, then you don't need much of accuracy, right? Okay, you just 600, 700 meters also within the target is good enough. Okay, so it just has to go. I mean, nuclear weapon detonation does not need a pinpoint accuracy. So they were developed with that kind of thing in mind. Second disadvantage was that as the technology improved, people could realize that if you detected the launch of a ballistic missile and could make out its initial trajectory, then it was almost possible to make out its target, that, where exactly it is heading and what path is it going to follow, because there was very little change involved. So intercepting a ballistic missile became a possibility. Okay. And then you just had to position yourself in the path of ballistic missile. You essentially cannot chase a ballistic missile. Like we see when you intercept an aircraft, you are chasing an aircraft, or a missile chases an aircraft, intercepts an aircraft. You see missiles falling an aircraft. Ballistic missiles are not intercepted like that because it is virtually impossible to chase a ballistic missile. So how it is done is that you anticipate trajectory which is almost fixed. That it will go like this and it will come like that. You position your interceptor on its way so that it collides. Whether due to proximity fuse or due to direct collision. If I was to give you an example, which I give, that you take a runner, very fast runner, okay, which is doing a 400 meters, let's say, one, sprint. If you have to intercept this runner, you can't change, let's say, someone holding world record, you cannot intercept it by following him, by running after him. What do you need to do? Because you have to see that he's confined to that track, and at this particular time he's likely to be here. So let me launch myself, or my interceptor in that direction so that it meets this interceptor. Now, what will happen is it will become very difficult to intercept this runner if he had the possibility to maneuver in between or change tracks, which you don't know that when is it likely to change track. So the kind of cross distance means, let's say I plan or I plot a ballistic missile's initial vector, and I say, okay, it is likely to hit this place. These missiles, subsequently with maneuvering, were able to achieve a cross distance of almost about 1,000 kilometers to 1,500 kilometers. Okay. Also, they could not maneuver much because of lack of aerodynamic forces in the outer space. How does aircraft maneuver? It maneuvers owing to aerodynamic forces, right? because it develops lift, it develops, reaction to the aerodynamic forces. Now, that air was not available in the outer space. So any kind of maneuvering which they had to do, they had to employ some reaction mechanism, some thrust reaction mechanism. Okay. So by which they had to maneuver, which was difficult. The advantage with hypersonic missiles is that cruise missile, especially, or the hypersonic glide vehicles, which are another form of hypersonic weapons, that they stay within the atmosphere for a long time. And when they stay within the atmosphere, they are able to glide long distance, develop aerodynamic forces, and maneuver by virtue of that. Okay, and they have their own power. The cruise missile has its own power, which assists it to continuously develop power and maneuver. So that is why, coming back to your point, that unstoppable, when you say they are virtually unstoppable from that point of view. And because they are closer to you, you have power, their terminal accuracy, is much better than some of the ballistic missiles, because you can put in terminal seekers, within limitations. Okay, and they can reach their intended target much better. So that is why they are kind of called unstoppable, right?
Now, here's a question I want to ask you, sir, if I may. From what you explained and what I've read, it seems to me that in air defense systems, like for instance Israel's Iron Dome and so on and so forth, these are designed in a sense to stop ballistic missiles or even other kinds of missiles, which basically follow a particular trajectory, what you explained. So you can place an interceptor and stop these missiles. But if it's a hypersonic missile which has maneuvering capabilities, it becomes all the more difficult for the air defense system to really stop them, and therefore they're unstoppable. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yes, absolutely correct. Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about the technology of these hypersonic missiles that we wish to acquire. What kind of technology goes into it, and why are they so critical for our immediate defense needs? We are in a very difficult neighborhood. We clearly face conflict consistently. Why are they so critical for us?
See, what happens is, let's start from the very beginning. Okay. Uh, when the engine, when we come to this hypersonic technology, it will be more interesting to know this in general, rather than getting into a specific project per se. The thing is, and if time permits, we will talk about it. Okay. Now, you see jet engine, on one hand, how jet engine operates, it takes an aircraft from zero speed. Okay, and there are three kinds of jet engines which are involved now when we reach hypersonic technology, right? So we say that, okay, there is aircraft, which fighter aircraft, or our airliners, they all use jet engine. Okay, and what is it able to do? It is able to pick up, gives you thrust at zero speed of the aircraft, right? So it sucks in air, it, compresses it, it burns that air, combustion takes place. And by Newton's third law of motion, when it expels, or, that air behind, uh, it gives you reaction and you move forward. It's a simple, Newton's third law of motion into action. The advantage is that it is able to produce thrust at zero speed because it has a compressor, right? But the disadvantage is it can only take you so far. It cannot work beyond a certain Mach number, because then the shock wave formation, the geometry of the engine, they start changing. Now we have had thrust engines, these jet engines, which have taken aircraft to, up to about Mach 2.5, Mach 3, like we had a MiG-25, it had to go almost into the near space to develop, that kind of thrust, or to have less drag onto that, right? All other fighter aircraft are, in the range of Mach 2.5 or so, or close to that. What happens beyond that? Now, if you have to achieve a speed beyond that, then what happens is, you need a different kind of engine. Then the engine which comes into operation is ramjet engine. Okay. Now, as you can, see in the illustration also, the ramjet engine does not have any moving parts. Okay. Why is it called ramjet? It uses the ram effect of air because air enters into it by virtue of its speed. It produces certain shock wave. Now, shock wave's theory is that when air passes through shock wave, it loses speed and the pressure rises. So that is how this compresses the air by virtue of shock wave. And then it's able to burn that and give you much higher speed. But what is the disadvantage? Disadvantage is that it comes into operation only at Mach 3. So you have to take it to a speed of Mach 3. It cannot operate from zero speed. So you cannot put it on the runway, a ramjet, and say that, okay, I'll put it on an aircraft or a missile and it will start operating. For example, even BrahMos cruise missile that you talked, it has a rocket to begin with. That rocket takes the missile to higher Mach numbers where ramjet comes into operation. Okay. And then it starts operating at those higher speeds and takes it into that region. So similarly, an aircraft, SR-71 was a very classic example, which changed from turbojet to a ramjet, and it's only one of its kind, which transitioned from turbojet to ramjet. Okay, now what happens is this ramjet also it comes into operation at about Mach 2.5 or so, more than Mach 2, but then loses steam when the speed goes beyond Mach 3.5 or Mach 4. It cannot accelerate it beyond that because you are still in the ramjet burning air at subsonic speed. Okay. If you want a speed of hypersonic or more than Mach 5, then you need to burn air at supersonic speed, burn the air at supersonic speed. That is why the acronym scramjet, which is supersonic ramjet engine. Okay, scramjet. Scramjets, geometry is very complicated. Now it has to have a geometry which produces oblique shock waves followed by normal shock waves. Okay, so that when the air impinges into this, it remains supersonic by the time it reaches the combustion chamber. Now you can imagine supersonic speed. How much combustion chamber can you have? 2 meters at the most, because how big a missile can be, right? So in the 2 meters or 1.5 meters, if the air is passing at supersonic speed, that is more than 340 meters per second, how much time will it take to pass or cover 2 seconds, okay, or 2 meters? It's in milliseconds. You have to burn this mixture within this time. So you need a flame stabilization. You need combustion. Your reaction time has to be so fast that it is less than your resident time. I mean, resident time is the time for which the air resides in that engine. Okay, it is like as they give example, it is like lighting a matchstick in a hurricane. You imagine hurricane kind of winds, and you're trying to light a matchstick in that. Okay, so this is the technology, and those very fine print that it is so difficult to master. So this is what the scramjet operation, and now for the cruise missile is what will it take to hypersonic speeds, and where what I said that the technology is still developed up to about 400 to 600 seconds of operation. Now, why 1,000 seconds? I'm saying, let's say you are not talking of 1.7 kilometers a second, or let's say we go to 2 kilometers a second. Now, this cruise missile, if it is not able to cover a distance of at least 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers, then it's really not worth it. I mean, you're not developing a hypersonic cruise missile just to attack targets at 500, 600 kilometers. Because when you say saving time, saving time has to be substantial. Like, colloquially, we are talking of bullet train. Okay. Now, I mean, you can't run a bullet train between Delhi and Agra. It's not worth it, right? It must have some distance to cover, right? Only then it is, effort versus payoff is worth it. Okay. So similarly, when you're developing a cruise missile, hypersonic cruise missile, it must give you that kind of payoff that when I'm talking distances, if my subsonic cruise missile, okay, is able to cover that distance in like 1 hour or maybe more, then I should be able to cover that distance in 15 minutes, or 10 minutes or 12 minutes. That is a kind of payoff, which is required where you are. And then why do you need this quick reaction? Because we are talking, sometimes you have time sensitive targets. What is time sensitive target? That let's say in the extreme thing, there is a particular type of missile. Say if we were to talk of nuclear tipped missile, now if they are being taken out of their silos, that like they are getting ready to be launched. You get some intelligence that, okay, these missiles are getting into action. Now, if this intelligence is available to you and you need to take quick action, that the time available with you is very short. Then you cannot afford to have a weapon system which will take ages to reach it. So probably for that kind of scenario, you need a missile which can be launched quickly, either through on the ground or through the medium of air, and it can reach its intended target. Okay. Now, even Kinzhal missile, for example, Russian. When Ukraine Russia war took place, we heard a lot about Kinzhal missile, that Russia has launched hypersonic missiles on Kinzhal. Even Kinzhal classically is not a hypersonic cruise missile. It is more of an aeroballistic missile, because it is essentially a ballistic missile, follows the principles of a ballistic missile, but is being launched by the medium of air. I mean, those F-31 kind of aircraft could, those Su, so not F, the Su class of aircraft took it up and they launched this missile from the medium of air. So that is how, this, and it traveled at that speed because it was a kind of ballistic missile and traveled at hypersonic speed. So it came to be known as, as if Russia has launched hypersonic missiles. Now, because you're not yet developing scramjet engines, the next popular format is hypersonic glide vehicle. So what happens is, this is a kind of glide vehicle which is again taken by some means, by some rocket forces, by some other, etc., to a very high altitude, like 100, kilometers from where it is released. And now most of the part it stays within the atmosphere, where it is, developing lift on its wings, etc., and is able to maneuver, and you are not able to predict as to where is it going, and it achieves, a fairly large distance. And because it is falling by virtue of, Earth's gravity, it obviously attains, hypersonic speeds. So this requirement of, from turbojet to ramjet to scramjet, okay, that is what is the developmental path. And this quest into hypersonic has been there, from 1955s onwards. 1954, X-15 program started. You must be aware of various X series program of NASA or of United States. Okay. X-15 aircraft started between 1959 and 1968. It flew some 200 sorties, 199 sorties, and the first winged aircraft, which reached hypersonic speed. Its speed, it reached about 6.72 Mach speed. Went to great height and produced some, plethoras of what do you call it, test points, which were so useful subsequently. And America, even now, is involved into various programs which can probably, will give it the hypersonic technology.
Let's talk a little bit about where India stands in all of this. From what you just described to us, there's been a lot of conversation about how India wants missiles to have even longer ranges, up to 1,500 kilometers or more, and speeds of up to Mach 8. From what you just described in detail, it seems like hypersonic missiles will be very useful to, in a sense, meet these two broad strategic targets that India might have. Would that be correct?
Yes, yes, of course. That is why India is involved in this technology. Otherwise it won't spend hard-earned money into this technology, because it is expensive. Okay. So this technology is of future, but like we say, that if tomorrow you have to call shots, or you have to remain relevant in the on the world canvas, or globally, then it is only right that you develop this technology, and you can't be seen trailing. It is not that the world has gone far ahead and you now start developing. This is the future. You will need to have this technology, and you need long range and accurate missiles. You see, what happens is both are important. Now, you cannot afford to launch a missile, almost a few $1 million missile, and then it does not reach its target correctly. Okay. There are challenges in hypersonic technology. We don't have so much time to get into that. There are metallurgical, challenges. There are fuel challenges. There are heat, resistant material challenges. all this is coming, into game, is stopping it. Now, why ballistic missiles are able to sustain it is because when ballistic missiles re-enters the atmosphere, it also generates very high temperature, 2000 to 3000 or
Mm.
2500 degrees Celsius. But it is momentarily. It is what heat shields, they break and they take that impact and they go. And by the time missile exposes itself to the atmosphere, it is at a much lesser speed, and they're not hitting the targets at hypersonic speeds. Okay, they have reduced to a much lesser speed. But what happens is the hypersonic missile is supposed to stay hypersonic for a very long time in the atmosphere. It has to sustain that 2000 degree and above, temperature for a very long time. So it is exposure to temperature, which is of essence. Okay, and exposure to temperature, like you must have seen these people, these children, doing a trick or showing you something. You light a matchstick, put it in your mouth and close the mouth, right? And you can say that, oh, see, I'm putting a burning matchstick in my mouth. Okay. But the fact is, it's very momentarily. It extinguishes the moment you close your mouth. Okay. You certainly can't put a matchstick in your mouth by keeping your mouth open. You will burn yourself, right?
Mm.
And now what happens is similarly, the exposure time matters. Okay. In scramjet engine, probably the exposure, not probably, I mean, essentially the exposure time is a hell of a lot. Okay. That is where this new technology
Mm.
will come into picture, right? And that is where you are putting your money and you are developing this technology, and it is required. I mean, if India has to, like I said, be relevant in the world canvas, then it must develop this technology.
I have two last questions for you, Air Marshal, if I may. One of my questions is that the two countries, at least that's what media seems to suggest, that have operational or deployed hypersonic missiles. One of them is China with its DF-17 class missiles and DF-ZF missiles, so to speak, and Russia with Zircon and Avangard. Now, and of course, the US, as you said, was testing its missiles. So is India. How do you see this? How do you see this competition or race to get
Yeah.
to to acquiring these kind of missiles?
See, what happens is like China, like I told you, China is ahead in technology in scramjet. They are, but typically scramjet engine is yet not fully into operation. Okay, they are
Right.
using these missiles, DF-17s, etc., which are hypersonic in nature, but follow a different kind of pattern. Okay, China experimented, FOBS, fractional orbiting, that system, ballistic system. Okay, now what happens is that FOPS, what it does is it goes around. What is the requirement of this fractional orbiting bombardment system? FOPS, what they call, it went goes around the Earth. Okay, and they can enter anywhere. In the United States, their main air defenses were north oriented. They were expecting threat to come from north. There was very little threat which would come from the south. Okay. So their air defenses, etc., at that time were not so much, geared up for the south. But what happens is this particular system broke that myth that okay, now you are going around. If you can go around the earth, then you can attack from any direction, right? So this is what the technology brought in, which got America worried. In fact, when America started this program, they wanted to strike anywhere on the earth within 1 hour. That is what their strategy was, which required someone to travel at 20,000 kilometers. They wanted to do continental strikes from anywhere, from their own system, because from their own earth, from their country, because they did not have many forward bases, or they thought that launching it from the medium of air may not be really practical. So that is where they started developing this kind of technology. But now what happens is this China, like we said, went far ahead. It has this technology DF-17, they have been publicly projected. Okay, now the thing is, Russia, yes, Russia was ahead in technology to begin with. Avangard, a very potent weapon, but they were initially developed. This is what had got worried US, that they thought that probably Russia will be able to now launch nuclear weapons much faster. Even when Russia went into space, the first one, I mean, Yuri Gagarin days, The worry of America was that probably a nuclear attack will come from space now. So anytime this particular technology has come into foray, it has been that probably nuclear weapons will be used. But now, over a period of time, why America wanted to develop these hypersonic weapons to differentiate them from ballistic missiles, because it was a given that if you launched a ballistic missile, it essentially would be carrying a nuclear warhead. Now, America probably didn't want to start a nuclear warhead even with a conventional ballistic missile, because one would say that how do I know that this ballistic missile is not really carrying, a nuclear head, right? So now what happens is, when that is why they wanted a different trajectory and they started investing in this hypersonic missile, which stays much lower. And if it is staying much lower in the atmosphere, then essentially it's not a ballistic missile, intercontinental or that kind of stuff. So you could probably differentiate. So all these countries, they have, made strides. They have their weapons which can travel far off. Now, each weapon, if you get into, it needs a separate session. And that is what I said, it took 2 years to write that book explaining these systems, okay, which are explained in detail. And idea here was to give a general idea, because moment you get very specific into this, it will become a very, very highly a technological kind of session, right?
I have one last question for you, Air Marshal, which is at 1500 kilometers, if that's the kind of range India is looking at, essentially it helps it counter to pretty much every corner of China, or at least strategically the most important corners of China. In a sense, that's how we would be thinking about it. Is that a correct understanding?
Yeah, of course. You see, what happens is, you should be able to target strategic positions, in any adversary country. I mean, let's take China, okay? That is where you have this kind of range requirement. So if you're not able to threaten their center of gravity, at a larger range with accuracy and quick time, then probably this, weapon will not serve the purpose. What happens is, you can still do it with ballistic missile, but like I said, it will take longer. It has to, exit atmosphere. It cannot maneuver so much. It can be intercepted, etc., etc. So probably their potential may not be that great as would be, from a hypersonic cruise missile, right? So that is why that probably understanding would be absolutely correct.
Thank you very much, Air Marshal Bedi, for this absolutely fascinating discussion. Very technical, but very, very important for us to understand the sovereign needs of our country as far as military and defense is concerned. Thank you very much once again for your time. Always a real pleasure talking to you. Of course, for many such conversations, all you need to do is press the bell icon on our YouTube channel, and we have these wonderful conversations. We don't dumb down anything. We try to make all these complex military and diplomatic issues more accessible to people. Do stay with Global Order, and thank you very much once again to Air Marshal Bedi for his time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure.